Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook, and with me today is Bruce Feiler, who writes This Life column for Sunday New York Times, is the author of 6 consecutive New York Times bestsellers, including Walking the Bible, Abraham and the Secrets of Happy Families. He's also a writer-presenter of the PBS series Walking the Bible and Sacred Journeys with Bruce Feiler. And the book we're going to talk about today is a fascinating read. It's entitled The First Love Story, Adam, Eve, and Us. Mr. Feiler, welcome to the program.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
This is interesting, and the way you went about researching it shows the diligence of a true scholar, because you've been all over the world looking at this. But let's start at the beginning. This is a story about two people learning to be together and to live as one.
So for me, the beginning, I have to say, is my kitchen table. Okay.
Okay.
I have a working wife. I have adolescent twin daughters. And that means I spend a huge amount of time talking about the thing that we all puzzle over these days, which is the changing way men and women are relating to each other, right? Lean in, can we have it all? This is kind of what we're all struggling with. And I write a lot about this in the New York Times in my last couple of books, and mostly it's what does the research say, or what's the newest technology that will make it all, work out for us. But as someone who's spent a lot of time around the ancient world, I can't help wondering, is there nothing from the past that's worth preserving? So a few years ago, we're on a trip to Rome, and we're in the Sistine Chapel and looking up, and there's these pictures of Adam and Eve, and my daughters are like, well, I see God and Adam, but where am I in that picture? And I realized that, hey, one story has been at the heart of every conversation about men, women, and sex for 3,000 years, and as crazy as it sounds, maybe the first relationship can tell us something about relationships today. But as you said, now where am I going to go? I have this idea. My book begins in the Garden of Eden in Iraq, but where? And what happens is I kind of start tugging on strings and realize, oh my gosh, all these people, from Michelangelo in Rome to Milton to Mark Twain to Ernest Hemingway, they've all talked about this story. So I get to go on what I think of as kind of this great scavenger hunt all over the world, from Iraq to Jerusalem to London to Hollywood to the Galapagos, trying to look at this story and how it's changed and how it's become, in effect, more relevant over time.
Uh-huh. I related because I just went to the Sistine Chapel for the first time about a year ago, and it's awe-inspiring. I didn't have the luck you had to be there solo the second time you went, which was just an incredible opportunity that I don't think many people have. Well, let's start with the Tigris and Euphrates, where a lot of scholars think this is the location of Eden, although the anthropologists and evolutionary studies would suggest it was probably in Southwest Africa. But this is where Scripture and legend says Eden was. And, of course, you went there at a time of bombings and kidnappings. But what did you get from visiting there?
Well, let me unpack that for a second, because I think there's two questions in there. One is this sort of tension between science and Scripture, and I think that's kind of worth pausing a second to talk about. People have been asking me a lot, sort of like, do you believe these stories are real? So, here's what I believe. This story has been at the heart of our conversation, our civilization, really the bedrock of it for 30 centuries. And as the dean of biblical archaeologists once said to me, I don't know if Adam and Eve existed then, but I know that they exist now. They're definitely in the Sistine Chapel. They're definitely in Paradise Lost. I was in Philadelphia with the Pope in 2015 when he was talking about it in front of 1 million people. So, they have become real, and there's no proof that this story, or frankly any of the events in the first 5 books, took place. But it's become part of our culture, so I think we need to take it seriously. Now, as for the story, the story talks about land emerging from a watery chaos, and then God plants this garden where 4 rivers come together. 2 of them we don't know. 2 are the Tigris and Euphrates. They come together in southern Iraq, and when you go there, there is, in fact, a little garden about the size of a basketball court that's got 3 living olive trees and 1 dead one. It's covered in concrete, so if nothing else, we've learned that Joni Mitchell was right? They paved paradise. But this obviously isn't the Garden of Eden, but what you see around is this marshy territory, and that's clearly what's being described in the opening verses of Genesis, of land emerging from a watery chaos, and this connection between water and land that was, of course, central to the desert people. And by the way, you have Abraham being born nearby in Ur, which is nearby, about an hour away in southern Iraq. You've got the Tower of Babel, and which comes out of these ziggurats in that part of the world. And so that is really, I think, that for these people of the ancient Near East, where they're trying to root the story.
Mm-hmm. This cradle of civilization, Western Civ anyway, is an interesting part of the story. Let's talk a bit about how little Scripture provides here, because Genesis has two versions of creation, and they don't tell us a whole lot about the life of Adam and Eve, but let's talk about the differences first, because that's an important note that we'll have to take care of later when we mention Lilith.
Yes, exactly. So basically, good for you. Everybody wants to know about Lilith. So basically, look, the first thing you discover is there's not one story, there's two. Okay, and in the second story, that's the iconic scenes of Adam being formed from the earth and Eve being formed from his body. By the way, it's not a rib. We can get into that. Her eating the fruit, her sharing the fruit with him. By the way, it's not an apple. We can get into that. They're kicked out of Eden, and then they have Cain and Abel, and that doesn't work out very well. And then they come together and have Seth, and he allows the story to move forward because he populates the human line. So all that is the second story, which appears to be about kind of like, well, whose fault is it? Who's the better sex, right? Male or female? Mm-hmm. But when you go back and look at the first story, what you've got is the two of them are created. God creates this one creation and then divides it into male and female. So what's true for one is true for the other. It begins in total equality, and that is really important to when later on we come back to it, because why is this not the story that we remember? Well, frankly, because organized religion gets a hold of the story, and that, of course, is mostly men. And they basically weaponize the story to hold down women. For example, they say it's the rib when it's not. It's the side. They're formed side by side. But why'd they pick rib? Well, because to pick a brain, the commentator said, would suggest that she's as smart as him, or the hand, that she's as helpful as him. But a rib is small and insignificant, and given the putrefaction, I mean, it's mind-blowing to read these commentaries and how they're basically are clearly have an agenda. So you kind of have to go back behind all of these commentaries to the story to discover, I think, what's very powerful for today.
Mm-hmm. And one of the points you make that I really like is it doesn't really matter whether you believe this is actual fact or a narrative that illustrates a very important aspect of humanity. The story is powerful, and it is used by patriarchs in Judeo-Christian ethic. But I was interested in the notion that this happened about 2,000 years before the Common Era, that they created this story, and that was about the time when we changed from hunter-gatherers to farmers, and that's a big deal in this because it sort of explains why the story exposes the being cast out of the garden.
Well, look, as you go back, what's fascinating about this story is that it kind of represents a breakthrough of thought. People don't give the Bible credit for this, that all the other stories, you have a man and a woman at the start of the line, a God and a God, or a God and a human. And the Bible is really the first major document that has a man and a woman at the start of the human line. And, as you're saying, in old antiquity, going back to kind of Paleolithic, men and women shared responsibilities much more. The whole idea of patriarchy really kind of rises when you have civilization and farming, and it begins to favor strength and war and all this kind of stuff, and women slowly kind of get written out of the story. So the Garden of Eden story, the Adam and Eve story, seems to kind of have an echo of this time when men and women were more equal.
The thrust of the book, really, in my mind, is how many different artists and writers and theologians contributed to the story of Adam and Eve to enhance and amplify it. And it starts with Michelangelo for you, right?
Well, he really does more than anybody else. So what's the tension I was saying earlier, right? In the story, there's this whole mixed collection of messages about equality and kind of back and forth. Then organized religion kind of does a more narrow interpretation that men are positive and women are negative. but you've got this kind of counter-narrative that begins to arise. Michelangelo does more than anybody else, right? So 1500, he's asked to paint the Sistine Chapel. It's not Adam and God with their fingers touching that's the most important image to him, though it's the most famous today. It's the next image, the one that's in the exact center of the Sistine Chapel. That's not Adam, and that's not God. That's Eve occupying the exact center, actually as a bridge between Adam and God. And in the next scene, when they're reaching for the fruit, they're reaching together, totally together, intertwined. That is the powerful message there. And he kind of does more to elevate Eve than anybody has done in a very long time. And once he does that, it's a little bit hard to undo it, because even as he said, like God provided the words and I provided the pictures. I mean, he sort of elevates himself to the Bible. And by the way, that's kind of how we remember that he was kind of right.
Mm-hmm. There's a great movie where I guess it's Charlton Heston that plays Michelangelo, and that's fascinating.
The ecstasy. But by the way, he's lying down, but actually in real life he stood up.
So one of the biggest contributors, and I want to just confess to my listeners that I think that everyone should probably read Paradise Lost. I never have. I bought a book with the gold leaf and all that, but it's difficult to read. But John Milton had a lot to do with how we see Adam and Eve today. Yes.
Really huge. And by the way, what a great story. He's lovelorn, he's romantic, he gets married to a 17-year-old, he's in his 30s, she abandons him, and he writes 5 books saying that divorce, which at the time is illegal, should be legal. It's an amazing story, and he goes back and justifies it because Adam and Eve were in love, and you should be able to love your spouse. And then late in his life, he's been in politics, he's been disgraced, he goes back, and in Paradise Lost, they're conjugal wedded bliss they have. And Eve wants to help Adam with the gardening, and Adam says, well, no wife of mine is going to do that. And so she's like, fine, I'm going to go wander off, get in trouble. And he's like, well, I guess I don't want you to do that, but I got to give you free will. So she goes off, she eats the fruit, she says, hey, man, this can be a win for the female sex. I should keep the power all to myself. And then she says, oh, no, but so dear, I miss Adam. And so she goes back, she gives him the fruit, and he's like, oh, my God, what am I going to do? But, I know I'm not supposed to, but I really want to be with her. So dear, I love her. So they choose each other, and then he has them leaving paradise hand in hand toward a far happier place. It's completely romantic. And this story really changes the entire narrative of Adam and Eve, because when you get to Frankenstein, which is a play on the Adam and Eve story, when you get to Darwin, who is influenced by this story, he really opens the door to seeing it as a love story, does Milton.
Wow, and Milton, a devout Christian, thinks about this basis of marriage that you treat several times in the book. That God said in the garden, it's not good that man be alone, and that's an important part of the story of the relationship between the two, Adam and Eve.
I think it's the central part, and I appreciate you're bringing that up, because look, positive psychology, the happiness movement today, right? I write a lot about it. We all talk about it. What's the number one lesson of positive psychology? That relationships are central to our well-being, right? Happiness is other people, basically. And what's the biggest threat to that happiness? Loneliness, okay? And we see today the opioid crisis, suicide, kind of a social crisis of loneliness. What's the first thing that God says about human beings in the Bible upon looking at Adam? It's not right for human beings to be alone. The Bible gets there 3,000 years before social science. So today, the scientists tell us, oh, the Bible has been read, who cares anymore? It's a fairy tale. Well, here's an example, a beautiful example, where that's not true. Or even people, frankly, who think the Bible is all they need, who need science. That's also not true. You put the past in dialogue with the present, the insights you get, it's just electrifying. And that's really kind of what I've tried to do in the first love story, is say, what do we know about love today, and what do we know about love then? And let's sync them up, and let's see, because the commonalities really kind of leap to the fore.
Let's touch on the theme of patriarchy a little bit, because one of the themes you talk about a little bit is that there were an awful lot of gods and goddesses at one point in our history, and then a lot of those goddesses became gods in the patriarchal, what I'll call, movement, for want of a better term, and equality is an issue here.
Well, and the point is, it's not always. I mean, this is kind of really the point, isn't it? It's not always been the way we think about it. Right? I mean, patriarchy was created, in effect, because in the ancient world, like the men would hunt and the women would gather. And by the way, the people ate more of what they gathered than what they hunted. So, patriarchy was invented as skills that males, were deemed to be better at, kind of rose up. But by the way, it's been undone a lot in our world today. We've seen it in our lifetime, and this is what happened with Adam and Eve. The story's been around for 30 centuries, let's just say. For 28 of those centuries, men were the only people to talk about it. But when women start talking about it in the 19th century, a whole new point of view pops up. You have Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the creator of the women's movement with Susan B. Anthony. She's fighting for legal rights and divorce rights and voting rights. And what happens? Everyone says, the Bible says women are secondary, or the Bible says, women are created from the rib, and therefore women can't vote or have property or take their kids in a divorce. And so she realizes she's got to go back to the story. So she writes the Woman's Bible in 1895. What does she do? Goes back to Genesis 1. She says, look, here they are, created equal. I didn't make this up. God made this up. She's totally, she's kicked out of the movement that she begins. It's too early. I mean, she's one of the most famous women in America. She takes on the Adam and Eve story in the 1890s, and she's flattened. It wasn't for another century, when the second wave of feminism comes along, that people were finally open to the idea that there could be equality and, frankly, ultimately love in the story of Adam and Eve.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Elizabeth Cady Stanton really doesn't get the credit she deserves. Susan B. Anthony gets more because she was sort of cast out of the group because of the Woman's Bible and some other things that she did in her life.
This is the reason we don't know who she is.
Yeah. One of the things that I don't think many people know about the first feminist movement, these four ladies in the Seneca conference, is that they were not in favor of the 14th Amendment because that gave more men the right to keep women from voting. Just added black men to the mix.
Exactly. Well, that was a controversy. I mean, she was originally kind of Stanton in particular was originally an abolitionist. She was, close to Frederick Douglass, but eventually they realized that having more men is, and that's sort of considered a kind of blunder on this movement. And ironically, ultimately, women went first. Obviously, sort of the women got the right to vote, and then we were still in Jim Crow at the time. So again, it's not until the 60s. Here we are again. Civil rights and women's rights kind of hand in hand.
Let's talk a minute about the folks who tried to recreate Eden in Galapagos, Frederick Ritter and Doris Strauch, his mistress. That's a very interesting story.
What a great story. I mean, it's an amazing story, right? So you have these he's a doctor, she's a patient, they fall in love. He has this crazy cockamamie scheme that they want to go to the Galapagos and recreate Adam and Eve, right down to the naked farming. But they're both married to other people, so they get the whole, they have this double date, so to speak, and they say, oh, by the way, the two of us, we've fallen in love, and we want to go to the Galapagos to be Adam and Eve. Would you guys mind swapping spouses? And they agree. So, the old spouse is right behind. They go to the Galapagos, and look, I'm the fool who decides to write about Adam and Eve and says I need to write about Darwin, because we see this as a conflict. But I actually think that Darwin tells us a lot about Adam and Eve. And you go to the Galapagos, as I did, and you realize that it's not just passing on genes. It's not just having children, right, which is sort of the whole Darwin idea. He realizes that human beings are different from animals in a lot of ways because we have love. We have this whole mechanism. And what's that for? That's to create a relationship, a bond, a family, because that's the most successful way to have successful children that can pass on our genes. So I actually think that Darwin, by the way, who had Paradise Lost with him when he was in the Galapagos,
right.
I think that, as you know from the first love story, I actually think that helps us understand why we even need love to begin with, because it's the bond of the family, which is sort of central, of course, to our culture.
And in that chapter, you talk a little bit about the nature of marriage and bonding that it's really interesting that the early church had a harsh view toward marriage, and Jesus himself suggested that celibacy might be preferable to matrimony, and Martin Luther said that a happy and tranquil marriage is when there's a subservient wife, which shouldn't be hard because women were created for no other purpose than to serve men and their helpers, and that sort of defined how marriage was in that era, didn't it?
Well, I mean, exactly. I mean, this is back to my saying that the story was weaponized, and you know, you can't. I mean, I was in Chicago about 2 weeks ago. Actually, my book, the first love story, has only been out a few days now, but this was a couple of weeks before, and so I hadn't really talked about it in all the media that's come, Good Morning America, and PBS NewsHour, and CNN and Fox. All this stuff I've been doing hadn't happened, and I was just kind of like previewing the book, and so I'm in 500 people in a hotel ballroom in Chicago, and I say I've written this book about Adam and Eve, and Adam and Eve, but frankly, especially Eve, have been victims of the greatest character assassination the world has ever known. And I just was kind of saying it, and like the women started like hooting and hollering, kind of like full Monty. And I realized, you know what? People are desperate for this message, and this idea that, you know what, marriage has been defined as a place where women serve men. How did they justify it? They justified it because of Adam and Eve. And who wants to live that way anymore? Maybe a handful of people do, but most of us are struggling with trying to rewrite the rules of equality kind of in real time with children, and with laundry that needs to be done, and school lunches that need to be packed. And so it's a challenge, and to kind of go back and look at the story. Eve is created from Adam, but Adam clings to her. Adam initiates the lovemaking that has the children. Eve gives them their name. There's a kind of back and forth that seems very contemporary. And the fact that, men and organized religion did what they did to the story is easy and important, I think, to dismiss. And this matters, I think, because we're trying to get it right now, and it's important to realize that they were trying to get it right back in the beginning of the story.
One of the themes that I'm fascinated by, and I think about a lot, is how sex became evil. I think Judeo-Christian ethic has a certain perspective, and it's interesting that some of the previous civilizations thought that sex was a gift from the gods, and now we make it nasty, dirty, evil. So...
And it's important to remember that always was not the case. I mean, the story itself, Eve is created from the side, and Adam takes one look at her. He's a guy. Like, he falls in love instantly. Oh, my gosh, she's the one, he says, right? Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. I don't think I need to articulate bone, flesh, what's going on here, right? He's very aroused. And in fact, the story says the two of them are naked and know no shame. It's very sex positive. And for basically 1,500 years, that's from the story written down, say, 1000 BCE, really until Augustine in the 4th century, it was very sex positive, right? And certainly in early Judaism, like having sex was on Shabbat. It was a mitzvah. And it was really Augustine who introduces this idea that sex is bad because he feels guilty. He's had a child out of wedlock. And by the way, there was pushback. Augustine, that was not readily adopted at the time, but over time, basically, Augustine prevails, and that's where you get this kind of sex-negative idea. But you mentioned Luther, when we get to the Protestant Reformation, one of the ways that they distinguished themselves, the Protestants, from the Catholics, was to say, our priests are not celibate, the family is really important, and there's actually an explosion of kind of Adam and Eve plays in the Middle Ages, certainly the Renaissance, saying there's Adam and Eve living in domestic tranquility with lots of children, trying to say, hey, Protestants are more sex positive than are Catholics. But then you get Puritanism, and even that kind of goes sour. So the church has had a very complicated relationship with this. But, this morning, I was looking at data about millennials and how they parent differently from boomers. And one of the things is much more open about sexuality, much more constructive. We know kind of gender beyond the binary. That's where we are right now. And there's a lot of that, a surprising amount of it in the original story of Adam and Eve.
Mm-hmm. I only have about 5 minutes, but I really would like to kind of give at least a little bit of an overview of all these authors that have affected the story, and that includes Hemingway, that includes Lord Byron, and many, many others. What would you say about how literature has affected how we perceive Adam and Eve? Because it's certainly expanded the short story we see in Genesis.
it's only 2,000 words. Hemingway wrote an 800-page book on it. So yes, and I think that basically they're not. I mean, I think the writers are iconoclasts, right? They're not beholden, if you will, to organized religion. So to me, one of my favorites, Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, right?
Mm-hmm.
God, Frankenstein is God. The monster is Adam. What does he do? He reads Paradise Lost. He realizes, he goes to Frankenstein and says, "I'm Adam. You better make me an Eve."
Yeah.
And that projects that story. Mark Twain, this incredible, beautiful writing about.
Oh,
Adam
that's such a great story. That the Diary of Adam and Eve. That's such a beautiful rendition.
And I end my book with it in the first love story because it's all about. He says, like, wherever. Oh my gosh, Adam says over her grave, even though she doesn't die in the story. He says of her, wherever you were, like there was Eden. Oh my gosh, how beautiful is that? Hemingway tackles Lilith. Lilith is, the idea that Adam had a first wife. They had a sexual conflict. She goes off. She becomes kind of a baby snatcher. He struggles with it. He writes this book, 800 pages, for 25 years. He dies without finishing it. Later, it's published. They cut it down to like 200 pages, and it's about the Lilith story, and it's called Garden of Eden. And it's fascinating that he struggled with this, gender identity, because we think of him as kind of such a macho guy. And so, yes, and so right down now, Beyonce, Bob Dylan. I mean, the story calls out to be talked about, to be reimagined, and it's really what I'm saying here. Like, if you want to strengthen your own relationship, if you frankly just think we need love in a time of division that we're in right now, if you come on this great scavenger hunt with me, I think you'll be surprised, as you've been kind enough to mention a few times here. I think you'll learn something, but in the end, I think you'll be uplifted, because this story is a success. And, God knows we need successful role models in relationships today. Yeah.
Give me 1 minute on the other aspect, and that is Adam and Eve as parents of a murderer and a murdered son. That you explore that with other couples who've dealt with that. That's an interesting part.
It's a beautiful part of the story, because we all think that, I thought certainly that losing a child will kill your relationship, but it's not true. And I spoke to the woman who did the research. I actually have an article about this in the New York Times this weekend. What did she say? She followed 300 families, only a handful broke up. How do they survive? They forgive. They show resilience, and in the end, they realize that they have to write a new chapter in their life story together. That's what I learned. Love is a story we tell with another person. And when you hit a rough spot, you realize, I can go my own way, or I can stay together. We can heal together. We can keep moving forward. That's what Adam and Eve do. And gosh knows, any of us who's been in a relationship a long time, that's what we have to do too.
Yeah, and the recurrent theme of forgive and write a new story is also evident when you talk about the other woman, because there are many people that stick together despite the commission of adultery by their partner, and I found that interesting as well.
Surprising number, and basically by not running away from it or sticking their head in the sand, by acknowledging it, and then as you said, moving forward. I think of speaking of adultery, the end of Hamilton, right? Alexander has cheated on Eliza. They lose their son. They come together. They hold hands. They go to the garden. They forgive. And what is the cast saying at the end? Forgiveness. Can you imagine, right? It requires an act of imagination. Love is not a choice we make once. It's basically a choice we make over and over again, and that's what they teach us.
And that's an apt conclusion to this interview. We've been talking with Bruce Feiler, the New York Times best-selling author of Walking the Bible and Abraham. The book is the first love story, Adam, Eve, and Us, and it's a great read. I recommend it highly. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. I thank you for listening, and I remind you that if you don't catch our broadcast on 88 FM at its regularly scheduled time, you can also find us on YouTube at Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook. Thanks for listening.